Great, thank you so much, Carolyn. Actually, we will only show the first part of the slides. Oh, host disable participant screen sharing. Well, as that is being set up here, thank you all for being here. We're really, really excited to have this conversation and to talk about some of the issues that we've been thinking about relating to information literacy, collaboration, partnership, and so forth. So let me just bring this up. It'll take a few seconds here. So again, thank you all for being here. We'd like to thank the conference organizers for putting this together and for inviting us to give this presentation. And first, we wanted to share that we're speaking in our respective territories. I'm speaking in the Bay Area of California and a settler in the unceded territory of the Ohlone Nation.
Hi, folks, and I'm speaking from the traditional lands of the Onondaga Nation, fire keepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral land Syracuse University now resides. We also encourage all of you to learn more about the native lands where you all reside, and you can do so by visiting native.land.ca, which I'm putting into the chat for those of you that haven't turned your face away. And also recognizing that a number of you might also be from the central New York region. Another way that you can support our local indigenous community is by visiting or making a donation to the Scanon Center. And the donations are directly used to support their programming and other efforts. And I can put that link in the chat as well.
Great, thank you, Tarida. And just to reiterate for those who are just coming in, I'm Ray Pun, pronouns are he and him, and I'm the Education and Outreach Manager at the Hoover Institution Library and Archives at Stanford University, originally from New York City and formerly a public librarian and a school librarian, and also currently serving as the president of the Asian Pacific American Librarians Association, known as APALA.
Great. And again, my name's Tarida Anantachai, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm currently the interim head of learning and academic engagement at the Syracuse University Libraries. And I'm also a proud member of APALA and part of Ray's new executive board. So.
Yes, this is a great opportunity for us to catch up here. And now we're going to turn off this slide deck as we promised, and we're going to have a conversation about these kinds of discussions that we've been hearing throughout the session, throughout the symposium. And we also wanted to keep this informal, but also informative, and hopefully, having this conversation on these issues and reflecting on them, how it impacts our work as instructors, our learners, our students, and within the profession itself. So first, let's talk a little bit about our role as librarians and involvement in instruction. So very briefly, for myself, I've been teaching library instruction in various settings in a public library, teaching students and the general public how to access e-resources, conduct research through our database, develop search strategies, searching for items on the catalog, and using the World Wide Web in general. And in academic library, it seems to have shifted with more engagement with faculty. So embedding information literacy into the course curriculum, whether they are 45 minutes or in our professional jargon called one-shots, sessions where we are showing maybe brief database demos, how to use them, search strategies again, and really engaging with different specific learners. So we have undergraduates, first-year students, then I've taught graduate students and doctoral levels, as well as graduate students in education who are pre-service teachers. And so in multiple sessions, different areas across the disciplines, and then engaging the learners through other areas, right? Like we got Wikipedia, we got citations tools that might be Mendeley, well, previously, Zotero and EndNote, scholarly information in terms of the communication infrastructure. And right now I'm in a special collections environment, primarily focused on primary source literacy and historical research. And over the years, my practice in library instruction has evolved. So adding active learning components, critical pedagogies, and the ACRL framework, assessing learning outcomes, but also assessing my own areas to improve as an instructor and as an educator. And it all really depends on the type of learners that I'm serving and supporting. And what about you, Tarida?
Yeah, so I love the variety of settings that you've been teaching at over the years, Ray, and how that's really shaped your approach to instruction. Most of my experience has just been providing information literacy instruction just within academic settings. So it's always interesting to hear from folks who've done it in a number of other settings outside of academia. I've been doing it for almost 10 years now, and primarily my role has been general and interdisciplinary instruction. A good portion of it has been for first-year students, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. But a bigger chunk of it for me has been for our international students, in particular, the undergraduate, graduate, and non-degree program international students enrolled at our English Language Institute. And for some additional context, this is an intensive English language program for students who haven't formally matriculated into their degree programs yet, although there are some who never matriculate into a program. They might be business professionals, and we've had lawyers, a group of architects typically come in, and others who are just getting that sort of intensive English language training before they go on to their other programs or back to their professional settings. So a lot of the instruction that I do with them is helping them to learn about the complexities of the US academic library system, since a lot of their prior experiences and their perceptions of libraries might actually be very different, right? So, and then I often talk about things like evaluating sources and how they themselves can critically evaluate their own information seeking practices, information privilege, search biases, that sort of thing as well. And in the past few years, I've also partnered with some of our subject librarians, and I see one of them in the room here today. So hi, Patrick, to coordinate a graduate research roundtable series to offer graduate students some other co-curricular graduate level instruction on topics that they might not necessarily be examining in their formal coursework, like data and citation management, finding grants and other funding opportunities. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a context to some of the instructional activities I've done over the years.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing, Tarida. I wanted to say I'm so happy to have this dialogue with you because all the work you're doing is so meaningful and so purposeful that it complements a lot of the work I've been doing. And so I'm glad you're able to make time to have this conversation. And for those who are here just joining us, we're having a conversation focusing on first year experience transitions, as well as library instruction in general. But feel free to bring your favorite mug or a drink and just listen and ask questions in the chat box or Q&A. And we'll be happy to look into that towards the end. And so yeah, let's talk about another issue that's been impacting all of us right now. So the issue is COVID-19 and how we are supporting information literacy during this time. As I mentioned previously, I had worked as a solo librarian supporting a teacher's education program, about 200 graduate students who are pre-service teachers. And it was a really rewarding experience because it was building a library from scratch. It was making sure that the library was set up in a digital format. So there were no print collection. It was a really small startup focused on e-resources and scaling up. And one issue that did came up quite a bit during COVID-19 was finding and accessing digital content. So there were challenges in the technical aspect more than the pedagogical process. So I'm sure, like many of you, we've had students having trouble finding ebooks, ensuring the ebooks were accessible to them or in compliance, and getting that rhythm of using these ebook database platform during such an intense time has been, quite frankly, really challenging. And for those who might be used to using ebooks, we have found out that suddenly they want to use print because they were just sick and tired of looking, at Zoom all day and then also taking notes online and prefer having something physical. But it wasn't really necessarily possible in the setting I was in. And then the issue that I think seems to bug a lot of e-resource librarians, as well as myself, is the digital rights management, not having that, right? Not having the ability to download the books after you get them in the e-platform. So it was quite tricky to explain to them, the process of that, and it was difficult just conducting research online. For something that really stood out during this time, teaching online, as I mentioned, the students I served were educators. My dean at the time was like, oh, this was around March 2020, I believe, when things were shutting down. My dean had asked me, hey, we need updated research or articles on how you teach kindergarten synchronously. He was like, can you find some articles about that? And I, of course I ran searches, I searched all around and there wasn't anything. And it was just so interesting to hear that because he needed sources to teach his students who are teachers teaching kindergarten, how to teach them online. And it was so complicated, it was a conundrum. And I think one of the silver lining of this COVID, hopefully, as I discussed with the dean, is that maybe that we would have more research on how do we teach effectively, synchronously and asynchronously at all grade levels. But overall, I will say that during that period, even though things were remote, we had videos set up like tutorials, I had one-on-one sessions with students on Zoom, group sessions. Students were still struggling and wanted to get that research over with. And I don't blame them. I think it was the same with faculty. Faculty expressed how difficult it was to focus solely online and in general. And so one takeaway I had was the opportunity to infuse concepts, like one you mentioned actually, Tarida, information privilege, to teach students how to think critically about information access as they were teachers. So according to scholar Charbuth, quote, information privilege is the idea that access to information can be based on an individual's status, affiliation, or power. Access to information can be blocked by various means, including geography, access, or technology, financial standing, and identity. So all of these elements can really create one's research experience, and it might vary from one individual to another based on these circumstances. And I thought it was important to teach this kind of concept because it was instrumental for students to learn and understand their schools where they were working on site, the resources that were afforded to them or not, and where they were coming from, and without access to every resources out there, and what it means when they don't have a school librarian or school library or school media specialist in their teaching sites. What does that mean, and how does that impact them and their own students too? So recognizing their own privilege or lack of and accessing information can be really an eye-opening experience, having them to reflect that. And that was part of a conversation we would facilitate online and then also on site in person before. And in addition to that, during COVID-19, the height of it last year, I'd say around maybe April, I led a series of privacy training workshops for students as a member of Library Freedom Institute, which is an awesome training program for privacy advocacy and advocates in the library profession. I encourage everyone to check it out. It's called Library Freedom Institute. I learned that it was so critical for students to know how to manage their online privacy, but also for their own students who may be vulnerable. And so we had a good conversation around that in Zoom with faculty members to learn about these tools, how to use different browsers beyond the ones that were traditionally used. We might want to consider DuckDuckGo browser, closing our cameras when we're not using it, identifying threats, different ways to manage our privacy settings. And unfortunately, it's not going away. I think because we're constantly mobile, we're constantly online, and we're constantly, whether it's on Zoom or another platform, data is being collected, shared, and there's so much breaching, and that in itself can have impact. And then also there's this other area called learning analytics, which is a whole other issue that could pose some privacy concerns there. So I'll stop here and I want to ask, how about you, Tarida? How has COVID-19 impacted your instructional practices?
Yeah, when you mentioned learning analytics, you also reminded me of, all of the issues that came up with like proctoring on online proctoring this past year. So talk about privacy and a lot of conversations around that. So, but yeah, that's such a great sort of lead in into a lot of the really sort of nuanced considerations that go with, taking everything completely online. So kind of similar to that, I also had to take all of my instruction online, and most of mine was done synchronously, so live. As I mentioned earlier, much of my instruction has been for international students, and that was actually made even more challenging in that most of them were either not able to travel to the US to get to start their degree programs, or before they came into their degree programs here, or some of them were already here and had been basically stuck here for a year and a half, 2 years, and what have you, and just weren't able to leave and return to their home countries. So this was such an isolating, challenging, and just really stressful situation for all of them and for all of their instructors. And so whenever we had this live instruction for them, we ended up providing them for the students across multiple international time zones also, meaning that all of my classes were either early in the morning or late in the evening, just trying to find that kind of balance. But there were also a lot of issues with regards to connectivity and bandwidth, meaning, I had to be really conscious with not using too many videos or bells and whistles that could cause a significant lag. the other interesting challenge is that we had a number of students that were in countries that had significant firewalls. And so even at one point in time, our own domain, library.syr.edu, and maybe even syracuse.edu, was listed as an issue. And there were some students who weren't even able to get on our library website without using a VPN. And there are some countries that don't even have the ability to do that. So yeah, that was a little bit tricky. And so I tried to use, openly available websites and articles whenever I could to kind of mitigate that. But there were some occasions where a resource that I thought was freely available would surprise me. Like Medium was one that had a firewall for a group of students, which was a surprise to me. I think the other major thing that I tried to sort of instill in all of my sessions was being really mindful of what the students actually needed during that time, even if it didn't necessarily directly address the curricular content. So I'd been in touch with my instructors ahead of time just to learn, what the student situations were, how they were doing. And we'd work together to really figure out what made sense during my visit. Early on in the pandemic, as folks were desperately trying to seek out other sort of creative outlets and stress relief, I spent about half a session on more sort of like recreational or other creative resources, still kind of linking it back to some of our own. So our Canopy streaming video database for movies. We have self-paced learning opportunities through like LinkedIn Learning, which we have at our university. We did like a virtual museum tour using Google Arts and Culture and that sort of thing. And then the instructors would often build an assignment off of that. And within all of my instruction sessions, and I still do this now, I always make sure to ask them, how they're doing at the very beginning and to really validate the varied experiences and feelings that are in the room. Probably one of the more affecting examples that I can think of was I was actually scheduled to teach a session almost immediately after the shootings in Atlanta this past spring for a majority Asian class. And in talking with the instructor ahead of time, she herself was at a bit of a loss as to how to address this, or even if she should. And then, some of them, many of them, if not all, had heard about it, whether they were here or from their home countries. And those that weren't here yet were even starting to ask questions. They were confused and just wondering, what this could mean in terms of their experience when they come to the United States. And so, after some extensive conversations with her, what we ended up doing was I ended up doing probably the majority of my session with them on bystander intervention and strategies for keeping themselves safe based on some similar trainings that I've been attending over the course of a few years or so. But really making sure to frame it not as this is something that they should expect to experience at any one given time, but just, a way of showing our concern and providing them the resources. Hey, we provide resources as librarians to evaluate a situation and then hopefully having the tools to be able to respond, which, they can also apply to their lives right now. So it actually ended up being a really fruitful session, I think, for all of us. And I'll be doing a very similar one for another set of students later this summer. So I think this is true all of the time, not just in COVID, but I think was just made even more apparent during the pandemic that we really need to just the importance of centering and honoring our students' experiences. If I had just gone through and plowed through a lesson plan on, citations and APA style, it probably, after such a devastating event, right, it probably would not be super productive for any of us. So.
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. I certainly see there are opportunities to really have these conversations. An important flag you raised was looking at bystander intervention and strategies in part of your sessions with your students. And certainly I think for those who have been working and they have their libraries or institutions have not been closed, that is tremendous strength to all of you to get through this. But for those who have had to work remotely and then come back on site, and then now with the fear, with this ongoing issues of violence, xenophobic sentiments and racism, so forth, I think, yeah, it gives me pause to think about ways to how do you incorporate these conversations into the discussions, because frankly, that's what students are thinking about, right? And we want to be thoughtful in how we approach it, as opposed to just, like you said, just dropping a whole bunch of citation activities and have them sorted out without thinking that this is also an issue for them to consider. And I like the other point that you raised earlier about broadband issues. And certainly I had my issues where some of the students didn't have reliable internet, and we had to rely a lot on the public libraries, which public libraries were lending out hotspots and looking up their hours and calling them up all across the state of California where the students were located. And so it is not a easy process to look at different public library systems. I'm grateful and thankful for my colleagues in those public libraries who have been able to implement these technological services, right? But it's been a challenge here for all, as you mentioned. And so I want to switch gears here for a second, and let's talk about partnerships between academic and school librarians, and maybe general partnerships. And I know it's been discussed throughout the symposium, or at least in some of the sessions I attended. So I want to ask you, what partnerships have you seen or experienced?
Yeah, so one of the first examples that I can that comes to mind, and I don't know if this is before or after your time, Rebecca, was a collaboration a few years ago hosted by CLRC, Central New York Libraries Resource Council, called Bridging the Gap. It was basically a series for local academic and school librarians to come together and discuss the high school to college transition. And so I want to thank my own wonderful colleague, Abby Kazowitz-Shear, who's I know also been attending this symposium, not only for her participation in these conversations, but also for graciously helping to refresh my memory on some of what happened within this group. So some of what they did there was they surveyed instructors at a number of universities and colleges within the central New York region, and maybe a little bit further than that, about the first year experience with regards to research, in order to help sort of inform what kind of teaching methods or ideas that K through 12 teachers might want to bear in mind. And so some of what they gathered through that were data on what types of research assignments they typically assign. What are the required types or number of sources that are required? What are the timelines? So is it a 3-week sort of thing, a 1-week turnaround, and other sorts of challenges that they've observed. The other collaboration that we've also had, and I saw someone earlier in the chat called it out earlier, SUPA, which is the Syracuse University Project Advance program. So these are college level courses that high school students can take taught by their instructors within their high schools. And I believe they also have the potential to then transfer those as college credits wherever they go afterwards. And so somewhat relatedly, for the past couple of our, years, our own information literacy librarian, Kelly Delavan, has helped to coordinate workshops between our librarians and the school library media specialists at those high school students' schools. And so I think that's helped them to get to know our librarians, but also help to inform them in kind of a train the trainer sort of way, because what I forgot to mention is that these Project Advanced students are able to access our Syracuse University resources remotely during the time that they're enrolled in that program. And so, yeah, and just to kind of discuss other topics around information literacy in relation to academia and to get on the same page and that sort of thing. So those are a couple that spring to mind here.
Yeah, I really like your examples on train the trainer approach. For me, it being involved in partnerships in the past and have been varied. These partnerships I've seen over time in my own work or in collaborations with others. I'll give an example, something I had seen, and I think maybe some folks here attending right now can also chime in the chat box or also think about their own resources and institutions. I know that there are teachers' resources centers and academic libraries. They're often maybe are also known as education libraries, maybe in the School of Education, for those who are in academic libraries, in providing support for teachers, school media specialists, or library workers in general, opportunities to expand the curriculum, to engage with the teachers, and professional development opportunities through that Teachers Resources Center. So where I worked before at another institution, the Resource Center was open for free to local teachers and librarians. I didn't oversee it, but I did think that it was quite popular based on what I saw for teachers to borrow teaching materials like an anatomy kit or some kind of literacy toolkit for their classes. And I also think these kinds of partnerships can be meaningful in building rapport over time. Certainly, there's a lot of policies to discuss and figure out the requirements and parameters, but when you're supporting local teachers or your own graduate students who are teachers or becoming teachers, certainly I think there's a lot of opportunities there, because then we know this is not a secret. We know that teachers are often underpaid, undervalued, and they tend to spend their own money to get these toolkits, depending on obviously what type of school that they're working in or serving. But for the most part, at least the public school teachers. And I have to say, for more general sort of public and academic library partnerships, that's a familiar space for me. I've spearheaded these kinds of partnerships and collaborations, for example, where we recruited undergraduate student ambassadors to teach in select public libraries in this part of a county. And so we're really focused on technology skills, because we know that the public library is the community for all. And having worked at a public library previously, I knew firsthand what technology skills might be a way to engage with such different communities. So we looked at technology skills, having the students teach in these public libraries, from coding to MS Word, applying to jobs, healthcare, downloading ebooks. And we also knew that the public library system that we collaborated with just were under-resourced and did not have enough folks to teach these workshops. But I thought it was quite memorable to share, because it was not only locally funded, focused within the county, but also we were training students to teach these technology workshops in different languages. For instance, in Spanish, in Arabic, in Hmong, or in Hindi, really critical languages to engage with immigrant groups that may not be speaking English in the community, and teaching digital literacy skills to those that were not engaged with the public library, and offering opportunities to utilize the library's technology resources and ensuring that they become familiar with the space. And we know that public libraries often face major budget cuts or staff shortages, as I mentioned. And that was something I found to be quite obstructive, not offering technology training in areas impacted by digital exclusion or other factors. But from those interactions with the student ambassadors doing the train-the-trainer model, I've heard that we need to also consider partnering with local organizations or community groups in ethnic communities, specifically maybe with temples, churches, mosques, and places where we think might be a really more effective way to do outreach, to get the word out that the public library is offering these technology workshops in these different languages and so forth. And we had several people coming into the workshops throughout the semester as the project was focused at that time frame. But clearly we needed to do more of a sustained effort. And I think it's often fun to do these initiatives and so forth, but then the question is like, how do you sustain something? And that's something I've been thinking about for quite some time. But I just wanted to ask if you have any thoughts on that or reactions.
Yeah, just one really quick thing that got me excited. I loved that not only were you helping the students to teach skills to other students, and certainly we have our information literacy program is, doing that to some extent as well, but also how they were able to do it in a variety of languages, right, in order to better reach and connect with the communities. So that's an incredible approach that I just want to be able to chew on a little bit more, particularly given some of the populations here in the areas that I liaise with.
Right. So on another topic here, one of the things I found to be a challenge, in addition to the lack of technology training or access to digital content in other languages, is the lack of school librarians in the country. I think this is something we are all seeing for the past decade or two. And so the question is, how are students being impacted by these shifts in the lack of school librarians, school media specialists, school libraries in general? And then we're seeing this growth of first-year experience or student success librarians or student services librarians in academic libraries. And so that's something that I've been thinking about. And in this conversation with you and having sort of that theme that's running in the symposium, right? What does it mean, right, when we're teaching? And how does that impact our learners? It's been something I've been thinking about for a while. I don't have hard evidence or data to suggest this, but what I see is a trend, a shortage of school librarians and a growth of these librarian positions supporting first-year students. And so I wanted to share that I had recently, maybe a month ago, had interviewed 2 researchers sort of looking into this issue on the decline or the evolution of school librarians. Deborah E. Couchell and Keith Curry Lance, they recently received an IMLS grant to explore SLIDE, which stands for School Librarian Investigation, Decline or Evolution. So in this brief interview that was published in the IFLA blog, which I'll drop in a second in the chat box, they shared some interesting insights that I wanted to also share with all of you. So obviously there's a loss of school librarianship over the past decade and potentially a disconnect with the larger educational communities. So their 3-year IMLS grant project will document the availability of school librarians in the United States and how equitable that distribution looked in terms of school characteristics and school demographics. So certainly they found that poor students, students of color were impacted by such a loss, and the positions were revamped or reconsidered according to their study. I did get to ask them on the decline of school librarians impacting first-year college students. And it was out of their research scope, but they did mention that it would be a task to teach first-year college students who have never experienced the instruction of a school librarian to enable them to excel in their academic studies. So I suspect since there's a growth of FYE positions or instruction roles focused on first-year students, that we see maybe the lack of skills coming in from students, right? Being, I don't want to say underprepared, but maybe not having the training, right? That they may have gotten from a school librarian, potentially. Having been a school librarian before and asking my graduate students at the time who are pre-service teachers about their school librarians, I found out on a survey, it was quite limited. Many of them didn't have a school librarian or didn't interact with the school librarian. Most likely the former, just didn't have a school librarian. And I know there are resources in the profession. I know all of you, some of you might have other thoughts and ideas you might want to share, but one resource that really stood out that might be helpful is coming from the Library Instruction Roundtable, which is the ALA's Connecting Librarians to a K-12 Transition. It seems to be a really good resource to have more discussions on this kind of topic. And I wanted to ask you, Tarida, what thoughts do you have on this, or maybe about student success roles?
Yeah, absolutely. When it comes to talking about the state of school librarianship, I think you certainly have more of that expertise than I do. And I think a lot of what you were sort of looking into really speaks to that as well. But yeah, I feel like I am starting to see this sort of trend, as you mentioned as well. So the flip side to that is this these FYE or first year experience or student success librarians that I certainly have seen a lot. I just saw 2 more that were posted just the other day, I think even at the same institution. So I actually would love to shift that conversation slightly over to that side of the equation. So what are your actual thoughts on these roles and some of the challenges that you've seen in them?
Yeah, sure. I think it's great that there are positions that are really focused on a group that is underserved historically in terms of the way the academic library is structured or academia is structured, right? Like there has never been such a focus on first year students before, maybe 10 years or so. And so but I also think it's so difficult to have the title success and in the working title because we're not really quite sure what success looks like, right? It varies campus to campus, administration to administration. And as someone who's been in such a position, it also feels like there's so much ground to cover, right? You're supporting 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 first year students and finding a way to engage with them. There are a lot of opportunities to of course, but it's also maybe the scaling part is quite a challenge. But I also think one of these positions have been challenging in keeping up with the demand. So first, you're usually a liaison to the student affairs or a first year program that requires focus on retention, which is the big element here. And at times, there are first year programs that have, for instance, in first year writing, maybe graduate students who are teaching assistants or adjuncts that rotate frequently semester by semester. And so it becomes really hard to build relationships. Those kinds of roles, it's really relationship centered. Actually, I would say all of the librarian roles are relationship centered, but particularly this one, because you have to keep up with the demand, the curriculum, the changing in technology. It's also, I think, an interesting piece that I see that maybe colleagues might not want to deal with this situation because it's sort of like you're dealing with first year students, incoming students. There's a lot of expectation to teach information literacy, right? A lot of those sessions that I mentioned earlier, as our professional jargon calls it, one-shots. And you have to be on top of it, plus the technology side, right? And being versed or comfortable with emerging technologies to engage with the students. And there are many pluses, of course, but then I think at times there might be lack of support, and it can be quite constraining when you're doing this alone, which I am hearing anecdotally, and even from my own experience sometimes. It seems to be an endeavor where you really have to build a lot of collaborations to get things going. Can't do this alone. And I learned about more of these positions in conferences, and I see student affairs, the professionals, our colleagues, if you're in academic libraries, those are great folks to collaborate. They also have the struggle too. So I'll pause here and I'll ask, what about you? What do you think?
Yeah, and I will co-sign that. The folks that I collaborate with that are kind of on the student affairs side, they certainly struggle with that as well. So absolutely. I agree with you with the challenge of having success in those job titles. Because how is it that we are defining success for one? And then what does that imply in terms of what are we then holding these librarians accountable to demonstrating, right? As you were mentioning earlier, there's been a lot of this focus on retention in higher ed, which then leads into questions about how the library leads to or contributes to retention, and thus how these student success roles also directly relate to retention. I actually attended a really, really wonderful presentation at the recent ACRL conference that was led by a number of student success librarians who I just want to name here in this space, Nikki Andrews, Melody Rude, Alexander Valencia, and Jesus Espinosa. And I thought it might be helpful to kind of shed some light on some of what they shared and, my own kind of personal reflections on it. So a lot of what they were saying is, in a lot of these student success or first year experience roles, they're often, as Ray sort of mentioned earlier, responsible for this general library instruction, orientations, even like wellness or other types of general outreach programs. And they're often, especially now, intended to also help the library connect with and build relationships with those from historically underserved communities, such as Black, Indigenous, and people of color or BIPOC, veterans, transfers, first generation, et cetera. And those are a lot of really unique constituents right there, right? And these librarians, many of whom hold some, but not all of these identities, are essentially being expected to be relatable to, and provide a lot of really nuanced support to some very specific populations, including, helping them to navigate the sort of hidden curricula of academia, navigating predominantly white institutions as a person of color, for instance. And, bear in mind that a lot of these positions are also often taken by early career librarians, particularly those, again, from historically underserved communities who may be expected to have the time and energy to be able to attend or host events outside of their regular working hours in order to connect with these students, right? So like at residence hall events, student groups, they might have their meetings in the evenings after classes. And somewhat relatedly, these librarians may also have to start to develop relationships and get buy-in from partners on campus that they might not necessarily have partnered with in the past, kind of similar to some of the ones that Ray mentioned earlier. So like these non-curricular units who might not be used to working with the libraries, for instance. I think another challenge is also that these positions are often seen as sort of like a catch-all or kind of grab bag role across a lot of different types of needs across the library, and might then kind of on the flip side be also seen as a role that lacks any sort of subject or domain or functional expertise, right? And then, I think you alluded to this earlier, but what are the support systems that are in place for these roles? One of the librarians from the panel that I mentioned earlier noted that there wasn't really a dedicated even networking community for these roles, and that you might see with other librarians. So you've got your digital humanities, your history librarians, your data librarians, and so forth. So much so that they actually created a listserv to start to kind of connect these librarians together. So I think there's a lot of challenges in these positions, both in terms of what's being asked of them, but also in how they themselves are being viewed and what they are individually might be trying to navigate and to help support on their campuses.
Yeah, interesting points you mentioned, particularly on the fact that these positions tend to be held by early career librarians who are from historically underserved, historically underrepresented and excluded communities. And so let's talk about equity, diversity, inclusion work and in relations to information literacy. I'll have you start off for us. What thoughts do you have on that?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this. So thanks in advance for listening, and maybe I'll cut down some of what I kind of had in mind. But one of the first things that comes to mind is inclusive teaching and culturally responsive teaching, and building that into our information literacy instruction. So for instance, earlier I mentioned like the hidden curricula of academia. And I think, it's really imperative for us as librarians or library workers, I should say, to think about how it is that we can create an environment in which first year students are not expected to figure out the hidden curricula of academia, of academic libraries, and research, like all of which, contribute to this concept of library anxiety. That is, how is it that we can create an environment where they are actually actively given the opportunity to succeed, as well as how they can see themselves reflected within that environment, right? Some things, we might have to teach them maybe new concepts or new ways of thinking about old concepts. It may require some unlearning, but I think we also have to be really careful to not fall into a deficit model of thinking that they know nothing about research, or I'm here to impart all the wisdom that they didn't get in high school, or what have you. So we need to actively be designing our classes so that they are welcoming, that they're validating, and that they really take into account the funds of knowledge and the experience that they individually are bringing into that space. So some of that could be thinking very intentionally about, what examples and images you're using, what types of active learning activities you're incorporated to engage all of your students' voices. And what is it that you're doing to cede power to them in leading the discussion? Though there's still, a power dynamic with you as, the library instructor, we don't necessarily occupy the same space as their regular instructor who controls their grades. So that's an opportunity for us to come in and potentially disrupt a power structure and to be more inclusive that way. But no, this isn't so much like, let's come up with a checklist of here are the 5 things you need to do to create an inclusive classroom, but just more kind of a mindset on how it is that we can critically approach our teaching. Thinking about, is the activity that I'm about to do going to benefit one learner's experience and preferred communication style versus another? But we also have to think about equity. So not just how can I make this a welcoming environment, which kind of speaks to the inclusion piece, but who is being left out or behind if I structure my class in this way? Or how is it that I can eliminate or reduce barriers for engagement? And certainly there are a lot of different ways that one can do that, including a lot of sort of virtual engagement tools. I think another part of it is, how is it that we ourselves can potentially respond to like hot moments in the classroom, so to speak. The first year of a student in college is a really critical time for them in feeling part of a community and building trust in every aspect of their college experience. So both the design of your instruction, as well as your response to potential issues that may arise within your class, that may further marginalize them, can have a deep impact on their sense of belonging or the otherness that they might be feeling throughout their college experience, right? Because, at the end of the day, higher ed was not fundamentally created to support those from historically underrepresented, historically marginalized backgrounds, especially BIPOC. In fact, they were originally built to be exclusionary and even prohibited admission from Black and other racial and ethnic groups. And then that very origin story itself has had very long-standing effects on the continued inequities and bias that we see here today. I told you I'd have a lot to say, but I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention that our time with them is also an opportunity to mention acknowledge the pandemic, right? And what it is that students have experienced over the past year and a half. This time they're doing it, some of them may be coming to campuses or entering into classrooms for the first time in 1 or 2 years. but this time away from their previous communities of support. And a lot of them may be facing still or have faced and are still carrying with them a lot of other traumas. Including racial trauma, including how the pandemic has disproportionately affected BIPOC communities, for instance, but also the continued trauma of anti-Blackness, anti-Asian racism, and that sort of thing. So this is a lot for them to experience during this time. So I think we all have to be really mindful of what it is that they are bringing with them into our spaces, and what it is that we can do to affirm them. Also, while developing them into critical thinkers and empowered producers of information themselves. So I'll stop right there because I think I've said a lot.
You said a lot of great points, and I'm going to have to download the audio later and then listen to it again, because I think it's so helpful to hear these different points of reminding ourselves as educators, instructors, and facilitators, how do we continue to make shifts that will improve, enhance the experiences of our learners. So I totally agree with all you have shared. And I'll say briefly here, in terms of EDI and information literacy, they really go hand to hand. When we're thinking of marginalized voices or missing perspectives in the information ecology or in the scholarship, in our databases, right? When we're thinking about those whose works are not easily identified or credited, or that they are not in traditionally published or mainstream format, there's so much to be said and considered with these elements, like you had mentioned, right? How do we incorporate that into those scholarly conversations with our students or with the general public as we're teaching information literacy related to that? And so I think for me, one thing that has been added to my own EDI work and information literacy is being focused on accessibility. So we're thinking a lot about universal design, ensuring that our resources, our websites are responsive, and we are prepared and set up, particularly for online instruction. We're most of us, for the time being, we're teaching on Zoom, and that in itself has a lot of issues, right, in terms of supporting accessibility. So for instance, closed captioning, having transcripts, alt text, a lot of different points and pieces to consider. And so it's important then simply the content itself, right? It's more also about the delivery process, like you were saying. And so I've been curious, as we're sort of wrapping up within the 10 minutes here, thinking about when we were now teaching online, but then when we were teaching on site, like the last time it's been. So for me, the last time it was about February of 2020. And maybe all of you who are library instructors or instructional librarians can think about that too for a second. When was the last time y'all actually like taught in a physical workspace? If you've been working remotely, of course. And at that time in February 2020, I remember having all the graduate students here in this ballroom, and then just like making sure that they're all following along, or able to see what I've been going through without thinking about all the stuff that we're talking about today. I mean, I did think about accessibility, but it was different. Now it's like, it completely is something I always think about. And thinking about how the databases work and showing them and teaching them, and then also surveying them at the end. That's how I found out about the school librarians issue, and also their privacy interests and so forth. Now I wanted to ask you, Tarida, what about you? Do you remember your last in-person instruction before the lockdown?
Yeah, when you first asked me this question, when we were prepping for the session, I had to actually look back through my notes, and I was actually really startled to see that it was also in February 2020. It was an advanced writing class for international students. And the reason actually that I was so startled is that the students' sample topics that we were using in class were on human rights and the previous administration's travel ban of early 2020. Note that this ban was not COVID related at all, but was rather on restricting visas from, I believe it was like Nigeria, Sudan, and a number of other African nations to the US. And this is after a number of other international travel bans and other sort of alarming restrictions that we saw that our international students faced. That came shortly thereafter, among several other really harmful and xenophobic policies that some of you may remember. So this is what our students are seeing, absorbing, and again, bringing with them into our spaces every day. So it was a bit odd and a really sort of unsettling reminder of all of that and what was on our students' minds back then, just before things changed even more drastically.
Yeah, very, very odd indeed, and ironic. And I wonder what it'll be like for many of us making that transition back on site. Well, this was a delightful conversation, and I wanted to ask if there's anything else you want to add.
Nothing aside from just thanking you for allowing me to be part of this as well. You've given me a lot of food for thought over this conversation, and I've really enjoyed it. I hope the rest of you found it fruitful, and that we can all kind of, again, kind of look critically at our own work, including, how workforce changes between school and academic librarians can have a direct impact on our students' experiences. So thanks for listening and tuning in, folks.
Yeah, I'm so glad we had a chance to catch up and talk about information literacy. So hopefully those who are still here after a long day of attending this symposium found it helpful in your practice. And thanks for being here. I don't know if we have time for questions.
You have got about 5 minutes, and there one question just popped into the Q&A. Can you see that from where you are?
Yep, I see here. I'll read it out loud. Thank you, Carolyn. What can be done to increase the number of certified K-12 school librarians in America's schools? Do academic librarians need to conduct in-person and virtual outreach to K-12 community to fill the gap of students' research and information literacy that exists during their first year pursuing college or university studies? I'm happy to work on the first one first. Is that all right, Tarida? So I think the important thing is we need to think about advocacy, and that requires all of us as library workers in the profession and community to be advocating for our colleagues. For instance, if we see on social media, maybe another librarian is saying that there is going to be a budget cut in such schools, maybe there's a way to engage with that. I want to give a huge shout out to the school librarian, Casey Boyd, who is in DC, who is constantly advocating for DC public library schools, particularly the libraries, to ensure that their positions are not cut. And I think working with the American Association of School Librarians, AASL, is also a great way to be part of that conversation, to be part of advocating for them, writing letters to your congressional stakeholders, your council people, making sure that word gets out, because that is a way to hopefully increase these positions, but also in this LIS programs, maybe having more introductions to school librarianship, because I think when I went to library school, there weren't many school library courses per se. Anything you want to add, Tarida?
Yeah, I think some of it I think was kind of addressed earlier, but I think we need to bring these folks together also. And I think things like bridging the gap. And I'm excited to see. I think Rebecca, you had mentioned in the chat that folks are already kind of talking about either reviving that or something similar to that in the future. I think that'll be a huge part of it also. In terms of other things that academic librarians can do to kind of fill that gap. I know that there are some institutions that do a lot of sort of outreach in their communities, right? So whether with their public library or with the other sort of school libraries in their areas, right? And that might be part of sort of a service learning type of opportunity also. And I think that that can be really fruitful as well, just for everyone involved. So long as, I remember I attended a presentation years and years ago about with an academic institution that was doing that with their local community. But they framed it in a way as, we're not recruiting you for our institution necessarily, but because we want to make sure that we have an impact behind, beyond the sort of ivory tower, right? And so I think that there are opportunities there, plus to kind of break down that type of town gown relationship that I think is also inherent in that. So I hope that answers the question, and thanks for asking.
And I'll say that there are local associations for school librarians. I know there's one in California, different chapters. If you don't want to consider like a national level, there are state or chapter regional levels that you can consider participating and forming collaborations for advocacy work too.
Yeah, that's true. I'm terrible at taking my own advice, but I guess, I'm a member of ACRL. I could be a member of like PLA, a public library association, or looking into some of those other associations, or just some of the scholarship that they're producing, because I think that can help as well. We need to get out of our silos, right?
All right, I'm not seeing any other questions. So if you had any other final thoughts in the last minute here.
Yeah, I wanted to say, somebody had asked about my t-shirt. It came from Etsy. So I think it was Sally back early on. And if I think there was a link that was shared, but also to note that we did not color coordinate. It just happened to be blue. I don't know if you noticed, Tarida.
I did not until you mentioned that. So
I love that. That's a nice ending there. Great. Well, Tarida and Ray, thank you so much. This is the last program of the day, and the presentations will start again tomorrow at 10 a.m. And then at 9:30 a.m. Eastern time, there's going to be a cooking presentation by Sarah Gluck. So registration is still open if you want to tell friends or invite other people. We're just going to keep letting people come in and join in the conference over the next 2 days. So this is so great. I really appreciate you joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Oh, go ahead, Ray.
Oh, no, yeah. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Same.
Bye, everyone.